Hello, Crime Squad. It has been a minute. I am glad to be back in the saddle to bring you more Canadian true crime cases. If you enjoy what you hear, be sure to rate and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every little bit helps to spread awareness for the victims and their families. I will be continuing to release weekly episodes on Fridays, so you have a new episode to tuck into every weekend. This is Season 2, Episode 1 of Crime Squad Podcast with me, your host, Natasha. This season starts with a case that went cold for over a decade but was later solved with advancements in DNA testing. Okay, squad, let's get into today's episode. Cold cases are intriguing for so many reasons, the main one being, of course, that the perpetrators seemingly get away with their crimes. With advancements in collection and forensic testing of DNA, many cold cases from decades past are now receiving the closure they deserve. For surviving family members, these advances come with hope that these cases will be solved once and for all. The use of DNA has changed tremendously over the last 40 years. The first time DNA was used successfully to convict a killer was 1988 in England. The powerful thing about this particular case was that the man had been arrested and found guilty of killing 2 teenage girls in 1986. The man was actually innocent, and this was later proved by DNA. The real killer was determined by the same DNA testing and was later arrested and convicted of the crime. There is an entire science behind DNA profiling, and from the mid-1980s onward, advances have been made in terms of how these samples are analyzed. Computer technology has come leaps and bounds in helping analyze samples using different methodologies. These advancements helped police to make an arrest in the murder of Lynda Shaw. The case was unsolved for 15 years until July of 2005, when DNA testing against samples collected in the 1990s revealed the identity of Lynda's killer. The Shaw family could finally put a name to the man who took their daughter's life, but with this news came conflicted feelings. The Shaw family was angry because this man had actually been convicted previously of 2 additional murders. And yet somehow, despite a murder conviction, the Canadian Parole Board had released this man from prison early due to good behavior. This is the story of Lynda Shaw. Lynda Shaw was born on November 23, 1968. Unfortunately, her father, William, passed away when Lynda was very young. This prompted Lynda's mother, Carol, to move to the quaint small town of Huttonville in Ontario in the mid-1970s. Huttonville borders the larger city of Brampton to the west. According to a Facebook page created about this little village, some of the things that defined Huttonville since its establishment in the late 1800s are dairy farming, prize cattle breeding, vegetable farms, and markets and prized flower farms. Generations of families have grown up in Huttonville, attending the schools and churches within the town, contributing to a very close-knit community. As of 2016, Canadian census data reveals the population of Huttonville is about 9,900. To put this in perspective, Brampton, the closest major city, has a population of approximately 670,000 as of 2021. Lynda showed a proficiency for math and science starting at a very young age. She was reported as being a kind and gentle soul who always tried to find the best in everybody. In the photo I found of her on the same Facebook group mentioned earlier, Lynda poses with 2 friends in the classic uniform of Brownies, part of the Canadian Girl Guides organization. I should note here that the name Brownies will be changing shortly to Embers in an effort to be more inclusive. There aren't many photographs of Lynda posted online. The ones I was able to find tug at my heartstrings. I'll post the photographs online at my Instagram at Crime Squad Pod. Lynda's face, even in black and white pictures, looks bright and fresh. Her hair is light brown and medium length. Her lips part to reveal bright white teeth in what looks like an easy smile. Her eyes have a definite twinkle. In the 1980s, Lynda would attend Brampton's Centennial Secondary School. Her education was focused on math and accounting, and she actually won the school's Proficiency Award in math and accounting. A promising young student, Lynda would also be rewarded with an Ontario scholarship to attend Western University in London, Ontario, and she would excitingly enroll in the mechanical engineering program in 1987. This was a huge deal, by the way, because women have been underrepresented in STEM programs since the inception of such programs. STEM, for those of you who don't know, stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. To give you an idea of some statistics behind this claim, the Science and Technology Museum of Ingenium, Canada, has organized an online resource center with learning resources about women in STEM. In 2013, they conducted a study and published the results. In Canada in 2013, 70% of college or university graduations were actually women, but of the 70%, only 30% were women enrolled in graduating from STEM programs. There is a long history of gender bias of women in these programs. As an interesting piece of pop culture, in 1992, toy brand Mattel came under fire for Teen Talk Barbie, which went on the market in 1992. Various educators, including the National Council of Teachers in Mathematics, lobbied together to protest the doll and have it taken off the market. Why? Because Teen Talk Barbie was programmed to talk at the push of a button, and her phrases included, "Will we ever have enough clothes? Want to go shopping?" and "Math class is tough." Within 3 months, Mattel had removed the phrase from its inventory and offered to complete an exchange for anyone who had purchased that particular Barbie with a new one. All of this, of course, to set the stage that Lynda would have been a rarity in her schooling program of choice. In fact, she was so passionate about what she was doing, she actually served as an executive for 2 years in her university's mechanical engineering club. In 1990, Lynda was a 21-year-old in her third year at Western University. In April of that year, she made a trip home to Huttonville for the Easter holiday. She made the 160-kilometer drive, about 100 miles for U.S. listeners. She had a nice weekend at home with family. Instead of the typical Easter dinner, the family changed plans and instead went out for an Easter brunch. Lynda stayed home late that night, but knew she'd have to make the trip home before the night wore on. April is exam season for university students, and she had one scheduled for Monday. Lynda, who had been watching TV with her boyfriend, decided around 11 p.m. it was time to go. She got into her 1989 Dodge Shadow and began the drive home. At approximately 12:15 a.m., she stopped off at a service center off Highway 401 in Oxford County. Stopping at a service center is part of any long drive. We've all done it, I'm sure. Either to use the washroom facilities, grab a coffee, get a snack. And that's what Lynda was doing that night. She stopped at the Burger King and purchased a meal for herself. Then it was time for her to get back on the road and continue the drive. But someone was watching Lynda that night, and what followed would be 15 years of pain and fear for not only Lynda's family, but lone female travelers who would forever think twice about driving alone on the highway. "21-year-old Lynda Shaw was missing. After leaving her hometown in Huttonville for an Easter weekend with family, she made the drive back to London, Ontario, but never arrived back to the university she was attending. Standing at 5'6", the clothing Lynda had last been seen in was blue jeans, white running shoes, and a blue leather Western engineering jacket. Disappearing was completely out of character for Lynda. After all, she'd been writing her final exams and was almost done her mechanical engineering degree at Western University. She had so much life ahead of her and was clearly ready to hit the ground running to build a life for herself. So where was she? On Tuesday, April 17, 1990, Lynda's vehicle, a 1989 Dodge Shadow, was located on Highway 401 around 10 kilometers away from the service center she'd left in the early hours of Monday morning. The car was abandoned and the rear window had been shattered. Notably, the spare tire from the vehicle had been used to change a flat. The subsequent evidence gathering within the vehicle revealed little. Detective Sergeant at the time, Bernie Crane, said officers found nothing in the car that could have been used to smash the window and no signs of a struggle. The food Lynda had purchased remained uneaten, which was odd because she'd just picked it up from the Burger King and got back on the road. After the discovery of the vehicle, nearly 300 people phoned or went into various police detachments across Woodstock and London to ask about or offer information on the case. Friends, family, and Lynda's classmates jumped into action immediately and began distributing hundreds of posters with Lynda's photograph and description to try and spread the word of her disappearance. Everybody was wondering what could have happened to her. They didn't have to wait long, however, because on April 22nd, 1990, Lynda was found. Unfortunately, she was no longer alive. Her remains would be located approximately 10 kilometers from the service center she'd stopped at, in a swampy, wooded area. Lynda suffered a horrible fate. She had been sexually assaulted, mutilated, beaten, and her body had been doused with an accelerant and set on fire. Lynda's family and friends were devastated, and the shockwaves would ripple to females across Ontario. Amid the police investigation, now upgraded from disappearance to homicide, Lynda was laid to rest. Her funeral took place on April 30th, 1990, in a funeral home in Brampton. She was buried beside her father, William. More than 350 people attended Lynda's funeral, using all of the 158 seats in the chapel, plus 200 others who stood outside listening to the services over a loudspeaker. Many residents of Huttonville came out in full force to show support, along with schoolmates from London and friends of Lynda's. The funeral home gave out evergreen seedlings to the attendees and urged everyone to plant the seeds in their gardens, in fields, or on farms in memory of Lynda. Funeral director Leo Archdeacon, a longtime family friend, asked everyone to name the tree the Lynda tree. Police were trying desperately to find out who was responsible for Lynda's tragic end. They believed Lynda had been targeted when she stopped at the service center Burger King by an individual who had tampered with her tire, letting air out. This was likely why Lynda pulled over on the highway and changed her tire to the spare kept in the trunk. But there were no leads despite numerous tips coming in. The fear was mounting more and more each day. Lynda's name echoed through various universities filled with female students who would regularly make commutes to visit family while attending school. In an article published May 1st, 1990 in the Windsor Star, several students from the University of Windsor provided commentary. Many students refused to travel alone after what had happened to Lynda. One student remarked she wouldn't travel at night any longer, nor would she stop at service centers when making a journey. The fear was further amplified by the fact that police had not caught Lynda's killer. Lynn Bazar, a second-year English student, said, quote, "It is so frightening and frustrating. 95% of women don't even want to walk alone on campus. Women are really restricted in their movement." End quote. Police were working 12 to 18-hour days trying to crack the case with very little to go off of. A friend of mine from London named Michelle has vivid memories of Lynda's disappearance and murder. In fact, Michelle was the one who suggested I cover this case. She was in high school when the news of Lynda's murder broke, and her life was forever impacted by this tragic event. Michelle had this to say, quote, "I can honestly say that to this day I still think about Lynda when I see a car on the side of the 401. And the fact that there was so many unknowns to what happened to her, it was frightening. You just didn't know what to look out for or how to stay safe." End quote. News of Lynda's murder spread far and wide, with many communities trying to ensure they were keeping an eye out for each other. The fear was real. In fact, in Brockville, which is approximately 520 kilometers away from London, Ontario, a local member of parliament named Bob Runciman had bought 2,500 bright orange colored signs reading "Call Police" printed at his own expense. It was June 1990, and the posters cost him $1,200, but he felt like it was a small price to pay to keep citizens safe. Runciman was quoted as saying, "Since Lynda Shaw's murder, many people have been living in abject fear of their vehicles breaking down while traveling Ontario's highways. You just don't know who you can trust, and this emergency poster should assist motorists in these situations." End quote. In July of 1990, 3 months after Lynda's body was found, police released a lead to the media. They had located a navy duffel coat size 42 with plaid lining. The coat was partially burned and left behind within a meter at the scene where Lynda's body was found. Police felt satisfied the coat belonged to the person responsible. They revealed it had been bought mail order from Sears in the late 1970s and urged members of the public to call police if they knew someone who drove a dark-colored pickup truck and had a similar coat. Police had also interviewed 10 motorists traveling the highway the night Lynda was driving home. These witnesses reported they saw a man in the same navy duffel coat standing near a woman at the side of the 401 highway. The woman was presumed to be Lynda. There was also a pickup truck stopped alongside Lynda's 1989 Dodge Shadow. The man spotted was believed to be white, approximately 5'9" and of average build. An FBI psychological profile of Lynda's killer said that the man probably works with his hands, possibly as a laborer. He would be quick-tempered and would have a history of stormy relationships and troubles with authority. No new leads were released for an additional 2 years when some new terrible things were happening to women in Ontario. Kristen French, a 15-year-old schoolgirl from St. Catharines, disappeared on April 16, 1992, when she was walking home from school. Police believed she was abducted by a man driving a cream-colored Camaro or Firebird. Tragically, Kristen's body would be found 2 weeks later in a ditch in Burlington. Police tried to investigate any links between Kristen and Lynda's murders. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, Kristen's killers would actually later be revealed as Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. In June of 1992, a woman was part of an attempted abduction not far from where Lynda's body was found. The woman, who was 26 years old, was traveling with her 3-year-old son from Windsor to Hamilton when she stopped at the side of a road to read a map. She was approached by a man driving a cream-colored Camaro or Firebird, thought to be the same car Kristen French got into when she was abducted that April. The 26-year-old woman, who was never publicly identified, said the man asked if she needed help, and when she said no, he reached into her car window, grabbed her by her hair, and ordered her to get out of the car. She escaped by biting the man's hand, forcing him to let go of her hair. She sped away along the shoulder of the highway, and the man attempted to force her off the road. His efforts, however, were thwarted by a transport truck who saw what was going on and drove up behind the vehicles, blaring its horn. Nothing of any relevance came from this attempted abduction. And despite the similarities between Kristen French and Lynda, police determined the differences outweighed the similarities. Lynda's case would continue to remain open, and all leads ended up being dead ends. In 1993, police released a portion of a letter that was mailed to investigators about a year after Lynda's murder. I'm unsure why it took police so long to actually come forward publicly with this evidence, but finally, after 2 years, the following was published. Sir, I was told Lynda Shaw was killed by a London bodybuilder who works as a bouncer at the Redacted on Wellington Road in London. His name is Lucas or something that sounds like that. A lot of the information was redacted from the letter when it was published, and it was signed by a Jim Gold. By releasing portions of the letter, police hoped it would generate fresh leads. They asked the public to look at the handwriting and review the name to see if they knew of any links. The public was urged to contact the Lynda Shaw homicide team if there were any tips. Sadly, nothing would come of this. And still, Carol Taylor, Lynda's mother, would stay hopeful that one day Lynda's killer or killers would be caught. In April of 1996, the Toronto Star interviewed Carol on the 6th anniversary of Lynda's disappearance and death. The article, written by Nick Prawn, revealed that due to advances in DNA, police now had something called a genetic fingerprint from the crime scene, and were taking a fresh look at a dozen possible suspects, one of whom was a deceased male. Detective Inspector Ross Bingley, who at the time was one of 5 provincial police officers on the case, had this to say: "I'm optimistic we'll find the people responsible. Police forces do not forget about unsolved murders." But the case would sit unsolved for another 9 years. And the case would sit cold for another 12 years until police would notify Lynda's family they knew who had killed her. Even though the case was cold, police always had an officer assigned to the case full-time. Over the years, police received over 8,000 tips, and each one was investigated. In 2004, there was a break in the case. Police went out on a limb and decided to test a hair found at the crime scene against several other hairs that were collected from known criminals in 1990. These hairs had previously been rejected for DNA testing because they had been cut samples, whereas DNA testing requires the follicle of the hair. There were 40 samples of hair gathered overall, and upon further inspection in 2004, about half of the samples were found to contain enough of the hair follicle to have DNA testing conducted. They were sent to a lab, and in July of 2005, police found a match. In August of 2005, Lynda Shaw's family would finally know who killed their daughter. Except they wouldn't. Police initially refused to release the name of the perpetrator because he was deceased. The reasoning was because the deceased would not have the right to a fair trial due to his death and could not defend himself against the charges, they couldn't release his information. This infuriated Lynda's family, and many people began questioning just who police were protecting. The DNA match meant the likelihood of someone else having committed the crime was 1 in 190 trillion. It didn't take long, though, for the name to be leaked to the media some way or another. By August of 2005, the name and details were released. Alan Craig MacDonald was Lynda Shaw's killer. And shockingly, MacDonald wasn't a first-time criminal. Again, to the hurt and disappointment of Lynda's family and the public, who eagerly waited to hear more about the killer, it was revealed MacDonald had actually previously been sentenced to death for 2 murders he had committed in 1975. He escaped the noose because capital punishment was removed from Canada's Criminal Code in 1976. So his term was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 10 years. These brutal murders happened in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, when MacDonald was only 22 years old. One victim was a young police officer, Corporal Eric Spicer, a father of 2, who was only 28 years old at the time. MacDonald shot Corporal Spicer in the head 3 times with his own service pistol. He was the first officer to die in the line of duty in Dartmouth. The Dartmouth Police Department renamed the department after him in his honor. Keith McCallum, a 23-year-old taxi driver, was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was shot in the head because he witnessed the murder of Corporal Spicer. Carol Taylor, Lynda's mother, was quoted by the London Free Press in an article in August of 2005 as saying, quote, "I feel that Lynda and our family have been betrayed by a federal judicial system that put a cold-blooded murderer back on the street." End quote. And she's not wrong. After all, that's exactly what had happened. In late 1989, the Canadian Parole Board made the decision to release MacDonald from prison due to good behavior. He had served 12 years behind bars. 12 years for 2 vicious murders. He was released to a Brantford halfway house just months before Lynda would be targeted and killed. Somehow, MacDonald was granted parole even though he had not taken any kind of intervention program after being incarcerated. It was also in his file that he had an inability to control his temper, which one of his parole officers said was never properly addressed. His request for full parole was actually delayed a few times because of these concerns about his temper. So I ask you, how does this indicate good behavior? According to a review that was completed by the parole board, it was determined that the actions taken at the time by the National Parole Board were appropriate and conformed with the law and its policies in place at the time. And yet, Lynda Shaw would suffer a horrible death at the hands of this man, who targeted her when she stopped for a burger and fries on her drive back to university that fateful April night. In 1994, MacDonald would be arrested following a high-speed police chase in Woodstock, Ontario. Just hours later, he would enter a phone booth to call his parole officer. While on the phone, MacDonald would shoot himself in the head, killing himself instantly. In the span of his life, MacDonald took the lives of 4 others. His legacy will not live on, but Lynda Shaw's will. In 1990, the University of Western Ontario dedicated a lecture hall to Lynda. They titled it the Lynda Shaw Memorial Distinguished Lecture Series in her Faculty of Engineering. The lecture hall hosts a wealth of individuals, mostly women in the field, a field Lynda was so passionate about. So, that's going to do it, folks. Another episode of Crime Squad Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my weekly episodes. If you like what you've been hearing so far, it would mean so much to me if you could rate the podcast. Every bit helps. And remember, if you have a suggestion for a case, DM me on Instagram at crimesquadpod or send me an email to crimesquadpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again to my pal Michelle for suggesting this episode. Remember, friends, stay safe and be kind to each other.